Edward Hale took the night shift at the auxiliary facility on the north end of the city, a post that had been offering triple pay for 2 full weeks, while every qualified technician in the district quietly looked the other way. The rumors were specific and ugly. Accidents without explanation. Systems failing mid-cycle. A whisper campaign suggesting whoever signed on would be walking into a setup termination. Liability, a career-ending audit. Edward read every word of those rumors. Then he looked in his wallet and counted what remained. It was enough to buy his daughter's cough medicine until morning. He signed the contract anyway, but at 3:17 in the morning, standing alone in the dark between screaming alarms and overheating equipment, he discovered something that could not only incinerate the building, it could bring down the entire corporation. And when the first gray light of dawn touched the city, a CEO was standing at his front door. If you stay until the very end of this story, you will understand why the most dangerous jobs are sometimes the ones that open the right doors. The city had been contracting for almost a year, not dramatically, not with headlines, but in the slow grinding way that exhausts people before they can name what is happening. A factory reducing shifts here, a logistics hub freezing hiring there, a dozen mid-size employers deciding that leaner was simply good business. For workers in the skilled trades, particularly those whose expertise lived in industrial electrical systems, the job market had thinned to something almost unrecognizable. Edward Hale lived in a rented house on a quiet outer street, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were small and close together, and the residents moved carefully around one another's silence. The house had a leaking gutter, a furnace that kicked on 20 minutes late in cold weather, and a back door that required a specific two-handed technique to lock properly. On the night in question, his daughter Bonnie was 6 years old and running a low fever that had not climbed past, worrying, but had not disappeared either. She had fallen asleep after 2 small spoonfuls of the last of her cough syrup, and Edward sat at the kitchen table, with the month's obligations spread in front of him: the electric bill, the rent envelope, the pharmacy receipt, the preschool materials fee he had been putting off. He was not panicking. He had learned to stop panicking some time ago. He had already been to the bottom, and he was not afraid of it anymore. He was only tired. He had worked steadily for most of his adult life. His certification in industrial electrical systems was solid, and his practical hours extensive. He had come within one supervisor's recommendation of a lead technician role 3 years prior. Then his wife had left, and his mother had gotten sick, and the medical expenses had arrived all at once, the way they always do. He had stepped back from the promotion, and then from a great many other things. Now he worked whatever the temporary agencies sent him. A former colleague sent the message just after 9 in the evening. One-night contract. Emergency rate, triple standard. North Auxiliary Facility. Whitmore Dynamics. Immediate start. The man had added one line at the bottom. I would have taken it myself, but I have my reasons. Edward had heard the story's unexplained equipment faults. A technician who had walked off shift without filing paperwork. Personnel at the main campus referring to the northern site in the careful neutral tone that people use when they know something is wrong and have decided it is not their problem. He sat for a long time. Through the wall he could hear the faint sound of Bonnie breathing. Earlier that afternoon she had tugged on his sleeve and asked, with the directness that 6-year-olds reserve for the questions that matter most, "Tomorrow morning, are you going to be here to eat breakfast with me?" He had told her he thought so. He had not been certain. He picked up his phone and called the number at the bottom of the message. Edward Hale accepted the job that night, not because he was brave, not because he was unafraid, but because he had arrived at the particular point in a life where the luxury of fear had simply run out. He arrived at the Northern Auxiliary Facility at 11:40 in the evening. The complex was larger than its official designation, suggested a full operational hub supporting the company's regional logistics network, which meant server racks, industrial battery banks, climate control systems feeding a live data center, and a dispatch floor that ran around the clock. At this hour, stripped to minimal overnight staffing, it had the specific silence of a large machine running below capacity. Christopher Lane, the head of security and facility operations, processed Edward's arrival without warmth. He handed Edward a laminated card, a site map, and a one-page procedure summary, and told him to stay in the technical monitoring bay unless a specific alarm required him elsewhere. One of the overnight staff passed through without making eye contact and paused just long enough to say, "Just so you know, anything that goes wrong in there, they need someone to put their name on it." That's why you got the call. What the procedure summary did not address, and what became apparent within the first 30 minutes, was the state of the facility's documentation. The maintenance logs showed clean status codes and recent inspection dates. The actual machines told a different story, the kind that experienced hands can read in the specific way a panel sits, in the color and cadence of indicator lights, in the particular sound a relay makes when it is working harder than it was designed to work. Edward had spent enough years in industrial electrical systems to know the difference between a clean log and a clean machine. These were not the same. He flagged one anomaly to Christopher, who told him the on-call engineer had already reviewed it and signed off. He flagged a second, a thermal reading in the battery storage corridor that seemed inconsistent with the ambient temperature, and was told to leave the environmental systems alone unless he received a direct instruction. The language was polite. The meaning was clear. You are here to watch, not to think. Across the city, Scarlett Whitmore was on her fourth interrupted phone call of the evening at a regional infrastructure investment summit. She had been CEO of Whitmore Dynamics for 2 years, having taken the position from her father Henry when his health had begun declining in ways that neither of them discussed. Her operations director, Margaret Voss, was on the line telling her the northern site's systems were showing minor fluctuations, but that everything was within managed parameters. Scarlett listened, asked one question, received an answer that technically addressed it without actually answering it, and went back into the room. 2 realities occupied the same night. Edward Hale in a cold technical bay reading discrepancies between paper and machine, and Scarlett Whitmore absorbing pressure from every direction while being assured, by the people whose job it was to assure her, that everything was fine. Sometime around 1 in the morning, Edward finished a methodical walk of the monitoring bay and turned his attention to the battery storage corridor, the area Christopher had specifically told him to leave alone. He told himself he was simply looking. Looking was not the same as intervening. What he found required him to stop walking and simply stand still for a moment. The first battery bank on the east wall was running hot. Not dangerously hot yet, but measurably and progressively above its nominal range, with a differential between its sensor readout and its actual surface temperature that Edward could detect with the handheld infrared thermometer he kept in his kit out of habit. The pressurized airflow in the corridor was cycling unevenly, suggesting one of the intake dampers was obstructed or had been manually overridden, and the sensor array for this section was reading low. Someone had adjusted the alert threshold. He pulled up the monitoring panel and compared its data to the physical conditions around him. The discrepancy was not ambiguous. The terminal was showing him a managed system. He was standing inside one that was moving toward a threshold it was no longer reporting honestly. He found Christopher and explained what he had found in plain language that left no room for misunderstanding. Christopher listened with the expression of a man hearing information he both believes and does not want to act on. The data center was mid-cycle on an internal audit covering several international contracts, and an unplanned shutdown would create significant liability. He said the word liability, the way people say it when they mean not my problem to authorize. Edward went back to the monitoring bay and sat for a while. He thought about what happens when a battery bank exceeds its thermal threshold in a sealed corridor with impeded airflow, and he did not enjoy thinking about it. He thought about the adjusted alert thresholds and about the difference between a failure that happens and one that has been quietly enabled. He took out his wallet. Inside was a photograph of Bonnie taken at a park the previous spring. She was laughing at something outside the frame, her shoes untied, which was characteristic. He looked at it for longer than he usually allowed himself. Then he put the wallet away. He did not put the thermometer away. The second-level alarm sounded at 3:17 in the morning. It was not the gentle chime of a managed warning. It was the specific 2-tone pulse that indicated a real-time deviation outside acceptable operating parameters, the kind of alarm that, in a correctly staffed facility, would have had 3 people moving before the second pulse completed. In this facility, at this hour, it had one. The battery bank he had flagged 2 hours earlier was now spiking hard thermal runaway beginning in the third cell cluster, the kind of cascade that does not stop on its own once it crosses a certain point. The pressurized airflow had dropped to a fraction of its operational output. On the central monitoring display, the data center's audit cycle showed 11% to completion on a reconciliation, covering logistics agreements across 4 international terminals. Christopher was on the coordination phone, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a person who has just understood the magnitude of what he is dealing with. and has not yet processed it into action. He was trying to reach the on-call engineer. He was trying to reach someone with the authority to authorize a decision that was running out of time to be made. Margaret Voss reached the emergency line from off-site. Her instruction was clear and immediate. Hold the system. Maintain the load. Do not interrupt the data center cycle under any circumstances. Edward understood what the instruction was. It was the order of someone who had decided that managing a fire was the acceptable outcome because the alternative meant admitting, on a logged and time-stamped record, that the conditions for this moment had been building for weeks under her watch. He did not follow the instruction. The auxiliary control conduit for the battery corridor ran along the east wall of the monitoring bay, a local override trunk that most technicians never used because the central system was supposed to make it unnecessary. Edward used it. He isolated the failing cell cluster from the primary bank without cutting the bank itself, rerouted the remaining thermal load through the secondary distribution path, and manually engaged the backup airflow system through a physical panel that had not been touched in what the dust suggested was a considerable length of time. He did this in a corridor where the ambient temperature was climbing and the air tasted of electrical heat, with his tools and his hands, and a site map he had read well enough to work from memory. He burned the back of his right hand on a conduit housing. He registered the pain without stopping. At one point, the air in the corridor thinned enough that he had to step back to the doorway for 30 seconds before returning. He returned. The cascade stopped. The data center continued its audit cycle uninterrupted. The facility did not lose power. No contracts were disrupted. From the outside, nothing had happened at all. Before leaving the monitoring bay, Edward photographed the control panel readings, the corrected airflow data, and the terminal screen showing the adjusted sensor threshold alongside its modification timestamp and associated access account. He saved the images to his personal phone and to a secondary memory card in his kit. Then he wrote a handwritten maintenance note and left it on the console. At the hotel, Scarlett Whitmore received a message from a member of her technical team. A contract shift technician on overnight duty at the northern facility had single-handedly prevented a thermal cascade event. The data center cycle had completed intact. There appeared to be evidence preliminary, unverified, that the conditions leading to the event had been developing for some time, and that certain monitoring configurations had been altered. She read the message 3 times, then typed back, "Send me the access logs for the past 30 days. He was not thanked. Not officially, not that night, not in any way that resembled what the situation warranted. Christopher met him at the exit when the shift ended and shook his hand, once grateful and ashamed of being grateful in roughly equal measure. He also mentioned, carefully, that the details of the evening were part of an ongoing internal review and that Edward should not discuss them externally until that review had concluded." Edward drove away with his burned hand, wrapped in a clean cloth from his kit, and his work jacket carrying the smell of electrical heat that does not wash out easily. He stopped at an all-night pharmacy and bought a better grade of cough syrup than he usually allowed himself, some antiseptic ointment, and a soft bandage wrap for his hand. When he turned onto his street, the neighborhood was in that particular pre-dawn stillness where the dark is beginning to relent without yet committing to morning. He unlocked the door with the two-handed technique and stopped. Bonnie was asleep on the living room sofa. She had pulled the spare blanket from the basket near the window, the thin one, the backup, and had wrapped it around her shoulders in the way that children do when they have fallen asleep trying to stay awake. One arm was stretched toward the far end of the cushion. The lamp in the corner was on. Edward set down his kit and knelt on the floor beside her. She was warm, but not feverish, her breathing even. He stayed still for a moment, not wanting to disturb her and also not entirely ready to stop looking at her. She stirred, her eyes opened halfway, and found him with the slow, uncertain focus of someone crossing back from deep sleep. "Was the job scary?" she asked. "It's done," he said. "Go back to sleep." She studied him for another moment, then closed her eyes. He covered her better with the thin blanket and went to the kitchen to heat the soup he had picked up. He thought the night was finished. He set the container on the stove and turned the burner on low, and then there was a knock at the front door. He opened the door in the clothes he had worked in all night. His eyes were the specific red of a person who has not slept and has been breathing stressed air for several hours, and the bandage on his right hand was visible. Scarlett Whitmore was standing on the front step. He recognized her immediately. Her face appeared in enough industry publications and news segments that it was familiar even without context. She was dressed as though she had come from a professional event rather than sleeping a dark coat, her posture controlled, but there was something underneath the presentation that read differently than her public photographs. She looked like someone who had driven a long distance at an unusual hour and was choosing not to acknowledge that this was unusual. A car was parked at the curb, with a driver standing at a respectful distance. She had come with one person, not an entourage. "I'm going to ask you to hear me out," she said. "I know what time it is." From behind him came a small sound. Bonnie, awake now, and curious, appearing in the hallway with her blanket still trailing from one hand. She looked at the woman at the door with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to stare. Scarlett's gaze moved past Edward to take in what was visible of the house, the coat hooks with a child's jacket and a man's work coat, the heavily worn steel-toed boots beside the door, the stack of pharmacy bags on the side table. Her expression did not change, but something in it shifted, the way a calculation shifts when new figures are added. "I came to verify a few things myself," she said. "And to thank you personally for what happened last night at the northern facility." "You have the wrong person," Edward said. "It was not entirely a joke." "I don't," she said. He let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had counted bills the night before, and she asked him to walk her through the evening. He did, in plain and sequential terms, leaving out nothing and adding nothing. When he reached the adjusted censor thresholds, her expression changed in the way someone's changes when a private suspicion is confirmed in public. He showed her the photographs on his phone. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. "Someone in operations management has been running this system in override mode to protect their performance metrics," she said. It was not a question. "That's what the logs show," Edward said. Bonnie had drifted into the kitchen doorway. She looked at Scarlett with the absolute directness of early childhood and said, "Are you really his boss's boss? Why did you drive here yourself?" The question landed in the room with the specific weight that only a child's question can carry, not cruel, not naive. Simply unanswerable in any way that did not require an honest accounting of something. Scarlett was quiet for a moment longer than seemed comfortable. Before she left, she stood in the doorway and said, "I didn't only come to say thank you. I may need you to say what you saw in front of everyone who needs to hear it." Edward did not respond immediately. She did not appear to expect him to. Scarlett returned to the main campus by 9 in the morning and called a closed briefing with her legal team, her compliance officer, and the 2 board members she trusted most. Margaret Voss was not in the room. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Scarlett had a clearer picture of what had been happening at the northern facility over the preceding quarter: selective disabling of alert escalations, maintenance records signed off without physical inspection, an experienced operations director quietly insulating her performance numbers from the real condition of the equipment under her authority. Margaret moved fast. Within 24 hours, a narrative had begun circulating among senior staff. The overnight technician had exceeded his authorization, introduced unverified interventions into a live system, and extracted proprietary data without consent. The framing was careful enough to sound plausible to anyone who had not been in the building. Several board members, whose primary concern was share price stability rather than accuracy, received private communications suggesting that escalating publicly would be more damaging than resolving things internally and quietly. Edward received a visit 2 days later from a legal representative he had not invited. The man presented a document described as a standard post-incident liability protocol and suggested, with professional warmth, that signing it would protect Edward from complications arising from his unauthorized access to Whitmore Dynamics' operational infrastructure. Read carefully. The document was a release that would effectively confirm Edward had acted outside his designated scope and waive any subsequent claims he might make. He did not sign it. He asked the representative to leave. He sat in the kitchen afterward thinking about Bonnie, and about stability, and about what happens to people who cause problems for organizations large enough to absorb the cost of making those people disappear. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with missed sleep. But he also knew what he had seen, and he had the photographs, and those 2 things together had a weight that was difficult to put down. His phone rang that evening. The number was blocked. The voice was Scarlett Whitmore's. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. She told him she could not promise him safety in the way he might want it, promised she was not in full control of the process and would not pretend otherwise. What she could promise was this: if he was willing to present what he had seen to a formal internal review, she would not allow what he said to be buried. She would put her own position behind, ensuring the record reflected what had actually happened. The call ended. Edward set the phone down and looked at the wall for a while. Whatever the cost was going to be, he already knew he was not going to walk away from the truth. He had learned, in the years since everything had gotten hard, that there were very few things a man could hold on to through all of it. He had decided that being someone his daughter could describe accurately was one of them. After the call, Scarlett asked her executive assistant to pull whatever background was available on Edward Hale, not for leverage, but because she needed to understand who she was dealing with, and she was honest enough with herself to admit she had not thought about him at all before the incident. She had been thinking about systems, about contracts, about incident classification, not about the person. What came back surprised her. He had completed an industrial electrical system certification with distinction and been promoted twice in 6 years at a regional manufacturing firm. 3 years before the current period, he had been formally recommended for a lead technician position. He had declined. No reason was documented in the company file. In a separate set of records, she had to specifically request. He had applied for extended family medical leave during the same period. His mother had been ill. His marriage had ended. He had chosen to come home to his daughter and to his obligations rather than the career he had been building, and he had done this in a way that left no formal complaint and no record of bitterness, only a quiet absence where a rising career had been. Scarlett sat with this information longer than her schedule allowed. She thought about the kitchen table, and the pharmacy bags, and the boots by the door. She became aware that she had spent 2 years running a company while believing, at some unexamined level, that the distance between people's positions in an organization roughly reflected their capacity and their effort. She had never closely examined this belief, because examining it would have required questioning a system she had inherited and refined and was the primary beneficiary of. Henry Whitmore appeared in her office doorway that afternoon. He was 63, thinner than he had been 2 years ago, and moved with the deliberate quality of a man conserving something he knows is finite. He sat across from her and looked at her with the expression he used when he was about to say something he expected her to resist. "Companies don't fail because a machine breaks," he said. "They fail when the people running them stop being able to tell who's actually worth trusting." At the house on the outer street, Bonnie had spent part of the previous afternoon on a drawing she presented to Edward over dinner. It showed a figure at the front door, a woman with yellow hair and a dark coat standing in front of a small building with a tree beside it. The proportions were generous and the details impressionistic, but the subject was recognizable. Is she a good person? Edward considered the question seriously, which was what Bonnie expected him to do. "I think so," he said. "I'm still figuring it out." Scarlett arranged a second meeting with Edward, not at a Whitmore Dynamics office but at a small restaurant near the edge of the warehouse district. She arrived first. He arrived 3 minutes later in clean clothes that were not new, and they sat across from each other without the professional buffer of a lobby or a conference room. He told her he did not expect people with institutional authority to understand what it meant to need a job badly enough to take one with warning signs attached. She told him she was not accustomed to people saying things like that directly to her face. He said he did not see the point of saying it any other way. By the end of the meal, she understood that he did not want sympathy. He wanted what most people in his situation wanted and almost never received: to be assessed fairly by what he actually knew and what he actually did, rather than by the circumstances life had placed around him. Scarlett called the formal internal review into session on a Thursday morning. The room contained the full board of directors, 2 representatives from the external audit firm, legal counsel for both parties, and an independent counsel appointed at Scarlett's insistence to represent the interests of the facility staff. Christopher Lane was present. Margaret Voss was present. Edward Hale was present. He walked in wearing clothes that were clean and pressed but did not cost what the other clothes in the room cost, and he sat in his chair without adjusting his posture to accommodate the assessment he could feel coming from several directions at once. Margaret's counsel opened with precision. The overnight technician had been hired for observation only. He had taken unauthorized physical action on live systems. He had removed data from the facility on a personal device. He had created secondary liability exposure by interfering with a situation his credential level did not authorize him to manage. The argument was well constructed and delivered with conviction. It would have been persuasive, Edward thought, to someone who had not been in the building. He waited until the presentation was complete. Then he asked permission to respond, and Scarlett granted it. He began with the thermal data, what the physical readings had been at 11:45, what the monitoring system had been reporting, and the gap between the two. He explained, in terms that required no engineering background to follow, why the gap was not an acceptable variance and what it indicated about the system's actual state. He walked through the timeline of his attempts to escalate through proper channels, noting the specific responses he had received at each step. He explained what would have occurred if the cascade had not been interrupted, using the facility's own structural diagrams. Then he addressed the alert threshold modification. He presented the photographs. He identified the terminal, the access account, and the timestamp. He identified the specific alert classification that had been changed from emergency level to monitoring level, and the date on which that change had been made 4 days before the most recent quarterly performance report had been filed. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice. He placed the information in the room and let the room hold it. Scarlett requested that the systems administrator open the original administrative logs, the full, unedited version, not the summary record in the pre-meeting briefing materials. There was a pause. The systems administrator looked at Margaret. Something was said in an undertone that did not carry. The original logs were opened. The room was very quiet. Christopher Lane had been sitting in the second row with the posture of a man who had been hoping, for several days, that the situation would resolve itself without requiring him to make a decision. It had not. He stood and said he wanted to enter a statement for the record. On the night in question, Edward Hale had been the only person at the northern facility who had both identified the severity of the situation and taken action consistent with correct procedure, and this was true regardless of what the authorization documentation said about his credential level. The administrative logs confirmed what the photographs showed. An account under Margaret Voss's operational authority had modified the alert classification for the Northern Battery Corridor on the 11th of the month. The modification had kept the corridor's deteriorating condition below the threshold that would have triggered automatic escalation to senior management and an automatic work stoppage pending inspection. Margaret said she had been protecting operational continuity. She said she had made a judgment call within her authority. She said the system would have self-corrected. Henry Whitmore, seated at the far end of the board table in a chair, slightly removed from the main row, said quietly, "You made a judgment call with other people's safety as the currency, and you lost. This meeting is the consequence of that." Margaret Voss was suspended from all operational duties pending further review before the session concluded. Edward sat in his chair and felt the particular exhaustion that follows a prolonged exercise of sustained control. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the way a long load feels when it is finally set down, not lighter exactly, but no longer his to carry alone. Scarlett met with him privately after the board had cleared the room. She offered him a position, not a temporary contract and not an honorary role in operational safety advisory function attached to the northern facility, with a mandate to review and reset safety protocols across the site. If the first 6 months went as she anticipated, the possibility of expanding to a full-time systems integrity role, covering the company's regional network. The compensation she named was more than he had earned in any single year of his working life. He did not say yes immediately. "I'm not interested in being the story your communications team tells about how the company learned its lesson," he said. "If that's what this is," she held his gaze without flinching. "It isn't, but I understand why you'd ask." He asked what she was actually committing to. She gave him 3 specific answers. A full operational audit of the northern facility, with results available to the board and external auditors, not summarized and filtered through management. A revised escalation protocol, removing the ability of any single person to modify alert classifications without a co-signature. And a direct line to her office, bypassing the organizational hierarchy, for any safety concern he judged serious enough to warrant it. He asked for time to think. She said he could have it. That evening he sat at the kitchen table with Bonnie and told her, in approximate terms that a 6-year-old can usefully hold, that there might be a new job. A real one. At a place he knew. Bonnie considered this with the gravity she brought to all significant questions. "Will you still have to go to the scary places by yourself?" she asked. He thought about it longer than the question probably required. "No," he said. "I don't think so." 3 days later, a package arrived at the house on the outer street. It contained a medical-grade burn treatment kit ointment, proper bandaging, a wound care guide, and a folded piece of paper. The paper said, "Thank you for choosing to do the right thing, even when no one was standing with you." It was not signed with a formal title, just a name, just Scarlett. Several weeks passed. Edward began the new position on a Monday, arriving at the northern facility through the main building entrance, where he was given a badge with his name and his actual role printed on it. Christopher Lane shook his hand in the lobby, and this time the handshake carried no ambivalence. The first thing Edward did in his new capacity was walk the full perimeter of the battery corridor with a fresh inspection checklist and a notation system he had designed himself, because the existing one had been built around minimizing what it recorded. He was, in this new role, exactly the same person he had been in every previous role: unhurried, direct, paying close attention to things that other people had found it convenient to overlook. The only difference was that now there was a structure around him designed to make use of those qualities rather than manage them into silence. Scarlett changed too, in the ways that a person changes when forced to look at something they had previously been looking past. She spent more time at the operational sites and less time in the rooms where the numbers about those sites were discussed. She had several uncomfortable conversations with members of her senior team that she had been postponing for the better part of a year. She started asking different questions, not the ones designed to confirm what she had already decided, but the ones she might not like the answers to. Henry noticed, and said nothing, because he understood that the most significant changes in people do not require commentary. On a Saturday afternoon, Bonnie came with Edward to the facility for a short visit. Scarlett had suggested it, describing it as nothing formal. Bonnie approached the visit with the pure forward momentum of a child who has been promised she would get to see where her father worked. She met Scarlett in the building's small front courtyard. She studied her for a moment, identifying her, and then produced from her backpack a folded piece of paper. It was the drawing, the woman at the door, the house, the tree. But Bonnie had worked on it since the original version. Behind the doorframe she had drawn a sun, large and detailed, its rays extending past the edges of the building. And above the figure at the door she had added, in careful crayon letters, a single word she had recently learned to spell: good. "I fixed it," Bonnie said. "Before, you looked sad. Now you look less sad." Scarlett took the drawing and held it in a way that suggested she was not entirely sure what to do with a gift like this, not because she was unaffected, but because she was more affected than she knew how to carry gracefully. Later, when Bonnie had gone to investigate a row of industrial equipment that someone had described as a robot, but was in fact a large automated cart, Edward and Scarlett stood side by side in the courtyard in the particular quiet of two people who have stopped performing for each other and have not yet decided what to do with the space that leaves. "I spent a long time," Scarlett said, "in a world where people only knock on each other's doors when there's something they need from the other side." Edward was quiet for a moment. "I spent a long time," he said, "in a world where nobody knocks on your door at all, unless something has already gone wrong." They stood there for a while longer without resolving anything, which was fine. Resolution was not what the moment required. On the night Edward Hale accepted the job that no one else would take, he had hoped for enough money to buy his daughter cough medicine until morning. He had not imagined anything beyond that, not a restoration, not a recognition, not a future shaped differently than the one that had been narrowing around him for years. He had only hoped to get home. He had not been able to know that the darkest point of that night would turn out to be the door, that on the other side of it, not in spite of what it had cost him to walk through, but because of it, was a life that had room in it again, room for work that matched what he actually knew, room for a daughter who would no longer fall asleep on the sofa wondering if her father was somewhere frightening and alone, room, perhaps, for something else, still something that neither he nor the woman standing beside him had named yet, and did not need to name to know was there.